Douala, Cameroon is home to the country's largest airport. Having several daily flights running year-round, the route from Douala to Nairobi, Kenya is among that list. Kenyan Airways Flight 507 was scheduled to depart from Douala Airport just before 10 p.m. on May 5, 2007. Unlike most nights, May 5th had exceptionally bad weather, but the captain of Flight 507 was planning on pushing through the inclement weather, and as a result, the passengers on board the Boeing 737 went for a wild final ride. Flight 507 was just one of 3 flights that was scheduled to depart nightly. The 2 other flights that were operated that night were by Cameroon Airlines and Royal Air Maroc, all of which were of the same approximate aircraft size, load capabilities, and route distance. Heavy rain, cloud cover, and thunder was very apparent in the area, and 2 of the 3 planes scheduled for departure remained delayed sitting in the terminal. Having to sit for more than an hour already, the captains of the Cameroon and Moroccan flights felt they needed to wait for the weather to further improve before getting ready to take off. Flight crews are generally responsible for the decision whether to take off or land in bad weather, usually depending on the guidelines prescribed by their airlines. While air traffic control can take measures to prevent flights, including closing down airports, such drastic measures are highly unusual outside the northern hemisphere, where heavy winter snows can block runways and bring traffic to a standstill. Furthermore, Douala Airport is not equipped with weather radar, but the Boeing 737 is. Pilots routinely take off into stormy weather and then rely on a radar to guide them around the towering clouds. The captain of the Kenyan Airlines Flight 507 was Batia Wamwe. The 53-year-old pilot was an experienced flyer with about 8,500 hours in jets, had joined Kenyan Airlines 20 years before, and carried the reputation of being diligent and professional. The first officer in the cockpit that night was Andrew Kairu. Age 23, while still being a very young pilot, he was training to fly 737s with Wamwea. At around 11:45, Captain Wamwea felt they had waited long enough on the tarmac, and that the bad weather had weakened enough to allow the 737 to depart. Being the most experienced pilot in the airport that night, he thought that once they were off the ground, he would be able to fly them around the weather en route to Nairobi. The captain then told his crew to go through the standard takeoff procedures. As Flight 507 was directed to a runway by the air traffic control tower, the captain didn't once get a clearance from them to go for takeoff. Not only is this against all the rules pilots must follow, but this also poses a massive safety risk. The pilot had no idea if the airspace he was flying into was safe or if it was cluttered with the waiting airplanes. Blatantly avoiding this takeoff checklist requirement, we are still unsure why these pilots ignored this. It might have been because the captain simply forgot, but this blunder may have led to a tragedy. Despite these obvious risks, the aircraft took off on runway 1 and departed Douala Airport at 12:06 local time, with the estimated time of arrival of 6:15 a.m. in Nairobi. While this aircraft was only 6 months old at the time of the flight, the captains that have flown it before noted the tendency for the craft to naturally have a slight bank to the right. Forcing the pilots to use the control wheel to counteract this movement, Captain Wamwea was right on top of this the second they took off. 24 seconds after takeoff, reaching an altitude of 1,000 feet or 300 meters, the cockpit recording notes that the captain let go of the wheel, and 18 seconds later, he called out to the other, "OK command," indicating to the first officer to engage the autopilot. This command was not read back by the first officer, indicating that he had not acknowledged the command. Neither was there audio confirmation in the cockpit, indicating that the autopilot had been engaged. In the 55 seconds that followed, the aircraft was being piloted by neither the pilot nor the autopilot. This led to it gradually increasing its banking angle from less than 1 degree to the right at the time the captain let go of the control wheel to 34 degrees when the bank angle warning came on. The captain may have panicked at the sound of the bank angle warning as he made a series of movements on the control wheel, which only aggravated the situation. He moved the control wheel first left, then 40 degrees to the right, then 11 degrees to the left. With the plane still banking right at 50 degrees, a belated attempt was made to engage the autopilot. The captain then tried to bring the plane under control by using the right rudder, causing it to bank further to the right. The first officer then gave his control wheel a near opposite command to what the captain was doing just next to him. The captain, on noticing the plane would not stabilize, engaged the autopilot. But by then, the plane was banked at nearly 115 degrees to the right. Being only 3,300 feet or 700 meters off the ground, Flight 507 was in an unrecoverable situation. Banking all the way over to the right, the plane began to descend at an extreme rate. Just after 2 minutes after takeoff, Kenyan Airlines Flight 507 crashed into a mangrove swamp just outside of Douala. There was no communication between the aircraft and the ground after takeoff or during the flight at all. 2 minutes after Flight 507 would have been expected to reach 5,000 feet, the point at which all airlines are instructed to check in, Douala Air Control Center issued a distress message. This is normal practice by any air traffic control when unable to immediately establish contact with the aircraft, which is a fairly frequent occurrence. But controllers, who had lost sight of the plane fairly quickly because of the storm, were not unduly worried because the plane had fuel for 4 to 6 hours of flying time. But once the aircraft continued to ignore their messages, they knew something was up. It was only 2.5 hours later at 2:44 a.m. when a search was launched after a local hunter stumbled across the wreckage while on an early morning stalk in the small village of Banga Pongo, just on the outskirts of Douala. Leading authorities to the crash site on the morning of May 6th, it was very clear that there were no survivors. The plane was found submerged under mud and water in a swamp about 12 miles southeast of the airport. After a week-long recovery mission, Kenyan Airways reported that only 29 bodies had been recovered from the crash site, while other reports coming out of Cameroon claimed that over 40 had been recovered. Workers reported that the bodies were badly disfigured and that identification would be difficult. Heavy rains in the area continued to hamper all efforts to recover everything at the site, as it was a slow and arduous recovery. The Cameroon government established a commission to investigate the crash with the United States National Transportation Safety Board. Early suspicions focused on the possibility of a dual-engine flameout. Because of the meteorological conditions and the nose-down position of the wreckage, the theory was that this would be consistent with the plane losing power to both engines and stalling while trying to glide back to the airport. When a final report of the crash was released in 2010, the investigation found that the following things had occurred. The aircraft departed without receiving clearance from air traffic control. The previous captains on the Pacific aircraft remembered having an everlasting right bank that had to be adjusted for. The autopilot did not engage, nor was the message acknowledged by the co-pilot. The pilots did not notice the aircraft was increasingly banking to the right. When a bank angle warning sounded 40 seconds later, the captain then activated autopilot, but his inputs on the controls led to a further increase in bank angle. All these things were attributed to bringing down Flight 507. But after taking everything into account, investigators determined that the crash was due to pilot error brought about by spatial disorientation, which is a person's inability to decide on his actual body position, motion, and altitude relative to the Earth and his surroundings. With no visual reference available and no scanning of his equipment, they decided that Captain Wamwea was confused and disoriented. Essentially, that they were flying in the clouds and he didn't know which way was up or down, flying the plane into the ground with little to tell the captain he was doing it. Either way, this was a tragedy that ended the lives of 114 people, crew, and passengers combined. Rest in peace to those who lost their lives that night. That is the story of Kenyan Airlines Flight 507. If you want to hear more scary, fascinating stories, please make sure to check out these videos.